In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the cold machinery of ancient empires, strange encounters unfold in the forgotten depths of dead worlds. Imagine, if you will, a scenario so bizarre and yet so perfectly fitting for the universe of Warhammer 40,000 that it could only exist in the twisted logic of the 41st millennium. Picture the moment when the oldest race in the galaxy, beings who walked among the stars when humanity's ancestors were still learning to make fire, discover something equally ancient in their own sacred tombs. Not an artifact of their own making, not a relic from the war in heaven, but something altogether different. Something that breathes, after a fashion, something that dreams, in its own mechanical way. A space marine dreadnought of the Black Templars, silent and still in its stasis sleep, resting in the very heart of a Necron tomb world. This is not a tale of immediate violence, though violence will surely come. This is a story about two forms of undeath meeting in the darkness beneath alien soil. It is about the collision of technologies separated by 60 million years of history, yet eerily similar in their fundamental purpose. It is about what happens when the Necrons, those beings of living metal who sacrifice their flesh for immortality, encounter a human warrior who made a similar bargain, trading a broken body for an eternal prison of adamantium and ceramite. The irony is almost poetic, if poetry could exist in a universe where such horrors are commonplace. Before we can understand the magnitude of this encounter, before we can appreciate the cosmic joke at play here, we must first understand the players in this strange drama. We must delve into what the Necrons truly are, what drives them, what they fear, and what they desire. We must explore the nature of the Black Templars, those zealous crusaders who have waged war without rest for 10,000 years in the name of a god who never wished to be worshipped. And we must comprehend the Dreadnought itself, that walking tomb that is neither fully alive nor truly dead, a consciousness preserved in metal, like a fly in amber, forever frozen in the moment before death. The stage is set deep beneath the surface of a world whose name has been lost to time, or perhaps was never known to begin with. The planet orbits a dying star in a region of space that the Imperium of man has marked with grim efficiency as a dead zone, a place where ships do not venture and explorers do not return. It is a world of ash and silence, its surface scoured by radiation from solar flares that occur with increasing frequency as its star enters its death throes. Nothing lives on the surface. Nothing can. The atmosphere is thin and toxic. The temperature swings from freezing to boiling, depending on proximity to the star's unpredictable eruptions. It is, in every sense, a dead world. But beneath the surface, in chambers carved from living rock and reinforced with technologies that predate human civilization by epochs, something stirs. The tomb world has been dormant for millions of years, its inhabitants locked in stasis sleep while the galaxy changed around them. Cities rose and fell, species evolved and went extinct. The Eldari Empire reached its zenith and collapsed into darkness, birthing a god through their excess. Humanity spread across the stars, fell into barbarism, and rose again under the banner of the Emperor. Wars raged, planets burned, and through it all, the Necrons slept. They slept because they had no choice. Their transformation from flesh to metal, from the short-lived Necrontyr to the immortal Necrons, had come at a terrible price. The Khaitan, those star vampires who promised eternal life, had delivered on that promise in the most literal and horrifying way possible. They gave the Necrontyr bodies that could not die, but in doing so, they hollowed them out. The souls were consumed, the passions were dulled. The very essence of what made them a living race was stripped away, leaving only the will to endure and the capacity for war. When the war in heaven finally ended, when the Old Ones were defeated and the Khaitan were shattered into fragments, the Necrons faced a galaxy that no longer had a place for them. The Eldari had risen to dominance, young and vital and numerous. The Necrons, depleted by millions of years of warfare, chose to retreat. They would sleep, their leaders decided, and let the younger races exhaust themselves. When they awoke, the galaxy would be theirs to reclaim. It was a plan that made perfect sense to beings who measured time in geological ages rather than mere centuries. The tomb worlds were prepared with meticulous care. Each one was a marvel of technology, utilizing principles of physics that the Adeptus Mechanicus would call heretical and impossible in equal measure. Vast stasis chambers were constructed, capable of preserving millions of Necron warriors in perfect dormancy. Command systems were installed, artificial intelligences of staggering complexity, tasked with monitoring the tomb's systems and initiating awakening protocols when the time was right. Defense mechanisms were put in place, from simple mechanical traps to weapons capable of reducing a tank to its component atoms. And most importantly, Canoptech constructs were left active, mindless servants of living metal, programmed to maintain the tomb and its sleeping occupants for however long the Great Sleep might last. The tomb world beneath this nameless planet had been constructed according to these specifications. It had been a minor holding, not a crown world where dynasties ruled, but a garrison post, a way station on the great webway-like network that the Necrons had once used to traverse the galaxy. Its defenders numbered in the tens of thousands rather than millions. Its nobles were of minor houses rather than great dynasties, and its strategic importance was measured in terms of its location rather than its resources. When the time came to sleep, the tomb sealed itself according to protocol, its inhabitants settling into stasis with the expectation that they would wake to a galaxy cleansed of the Eldari threat and ready for reconquest. They could not have known that their tomb would malfunction. None of them could have predicted that a cascade failure in the command systems, triggered by a seismic event some 30,000 years into their slumber, would corrupt the awakening protocols. The damage was subtle, not enough to cause immediate catastrophic failure, but sufficient to delay the resurrection indefinitely. The tomb's artificial intelligence, its tomb mind, found itself trapped in an endless loop, unable to complete the awakening sequence, but also unable to determine why. And so the tomb remained sealed, its defenders locked in dreamless sleep, while the galaxy continued its violent evolution around them. The Black Templars came to this world by accident and necessity in equal measure. Their crusade fleet, one of dozens that roamed the galaxy in perpetual war against the Emperor's enemies, had been engaged in pursuit of a greenskin warband that had been raiding worlds in this sector for the better part of a decade. The fight had been brutal, as all fights with greenskins were. The creatures had numbers and ferocity on their side, and their leader, a particularly cunning beast that the Black Templars had dubbed the Red Fist, had proven frustratingly adept at avoiding decisive battle. The Black Templars were not a chapter that accepted stalemates or indecisive engagements. Since their founding in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, they had maintained an unbroken crusade that had lasted for 10 millennia, refusing to establish a permanent homeworld, instead roaming the galaxy in their fleet, bringing the Emperor's wrath to every corner of the Imperium. They did not believe in the Codex Astartes, that grand treatise on warfare and organization that Reboot Gilliman had written to prevent any single space marine force from achieving the kind of power that had allowed the Warmaster Horus to nearly destroy the Imperium. Instead, they followed their own path, organizing themselves into crusading forces that could range from a few dozen warriors to several hundred, each dedicated to a specific campaign or region of space. This particular crusade had been ongoing for 17 standard years, a hunt that had taken them across 8 sectors and involved engagements on more than 30 worlds. The greenskin leader they pursued was unusually intelligent for its kind, capable of strategic thinking that went beyond the typical greenskin approach of charging headlong into battle and overwhelming opponents through sheer numbers. It had learned to use hit-and-run tactics, striking quickly at vulnerable targets, and then withdrawing before Imperial forces could respond in strength. It had gathered to itself a warband that shared its cunning, creating a force that was both numerous and tactically sophisticated, a combination that made them far more dangerous than typical greenskin threats. The Black Templars had pursued them relentlessly, following every lead, investigating every report, gradually narrowing the search area until they cornered the warband here, on this dead world, at the edge of known space. The greenskins had thought themselves safe, assumed that no Imperial force would bother investigating a planet so obviously hostile to life, so far from anything of strategic value. They had been wrong. The Black Templars did not abandon a hunt simply because the terrain was challenging or the location inconvenient. They had tracked their prey across half the galaxy. A little radiation and a dying star would not deter them now. The pursuit had led them to this dead world. The Greenskins had established a crude base on the surface, using the ruins of some ancient civilization as shelter from the solar radiation. The Black Templars had descended upon them with righteous fury, their drop pods screaming through the thin atmosphere like meteors of judgment. The battle had been fierce but short. Greenskins, for all their savage strength, could not stand against the disciplined wrath of the Emperor's chosen warriors. The Black Templars had carved through them like a power sword through flesh, their chainswords singing hymns of slaughter, their bolters speaking the Emperor's final sermon to the Xenos filth. But victory had come with a price. Brother Captain Godfrey, a warrior who had served the chapter for 3 centuries, had been mortally wounded in the final assault. A greenskin power claw had caught him in a moment of overextension, crushing his torso and shattering his spine. The apothecaries had done what they could, but even the advanced medical science available to the Adeptus Astartes had its limits. Godfrey would die, they declared, unless more drastic measures were taken. The decision to inter him in a Dreadnought was not made lightly. It never was. To become a Dreadnought was, in theory, a great honor. It was a way for a fallen hero to continue serving the Emperor even after their mortal body had failed. But everyone who had witnessed the process, who had spoken with the Ancient Ones, who had endured centuries or even millennia locked in their armored sarcophagi, knew the truth. It was not an honor. It was a curse dressed in the language of duty. It was a prison sentence that would last until the Warwalker was finally destroyed in battle, or until madness claimed whatever remained of the pilot's mind. But Godfrey was a hero of the chapter. He had led successful campaigns on a dozen worlds. He had slain enemy champions in single combat. He had earned the respect of his brothers and the fear of the Emperor's enemies. To let him die when the technology existed to save him would be to waste a resource that the chapter could ill afford to lose. And so the decision was made. Godfrey would become a Dreadnought. The process took time, more time than the Crusade fleet had to spare in one location. They needed a place to work, somewhere secure where the Tech Marines could perform the delicate operation of extracting what remained of Godfrey's body and installing it into the Dreadnought chassis. The surface of this world was unsuitable for such work. The radiation made it dangerous for extended operations, and the risk of additional greenskin presence was too high. They needed somewhere underground, somewhere shielded, somewhere they could work without interruption. The decision to enter a warrior in a Dreadnought was always heavy with significance. It was presented as an honor, a way for a fallen hero to continue serving the Emperor beyond the normal limits of mortality. But those who had witnessed the reality knew the truth. Godfrey had known it too, even before the process began. He had spoken with the chapter's ancient Dreadnoughts, those venerable warriors who had endured centuries, or even millennia, locked in their armored sarcophagi. He had seen the weariness in their mechanical voices, heard the faint echoes of barely suppressed madness that colored their words, sensed the profound isolation that came from being neither fully dead nor truly alive. But he was a Black Templar. Duty came before personal preference. Service to the Emperor transcended concerns about comfort or happiness or sanity. If the chapter needed him to continue fighting, if his experience and skill could still be brought to bear against the Emperor's enemies, then he would accept internment regardless of what it cost him personally. This was the oath he had sworn when he first took the Black Cross of the Black Templars. This was the commitment that had defined his 3 centuries of service. One more sacrifice in a lifetime of sacrifices. Their Auspex scans revealed the entrance to the Necron tomb. At the time, they did not know what it was. The readings were confusing, showing vast empty spaces beneath the surface, but no clear indication of what had created them. Some of the more experienced members of the fleet suggested it might be a natural cave system, expanded by ancient volcanic activity. Others theorized it was the remnant of whatever civilization had left the ruins on the surface. None of them guessed the truth. because the Imperium's understanding of the Necrons in this era was fragmentary at best. Some members of the Inquisition knew of them, some chapter masters had encountered them, but to the average space marine, they were just another Xenos race, no more or less threatening than the Eldar or the Tyranids. The Black Templars descended into the tomb. They found corridors of black stone, perfectly smooth and geometrically precise, in a way that suggested advanced technology rather than natural formation. They found chambers vast enough to hold entire companies of warriors, empty and silent. They found no signs of life, no indication that anyone had been here in centuries or perhaps millennia. It was perfect for their needs. The Tech Marines established a temporary workshop in one of the deeper chambers, a space large enough to accommodate the Dreadnought chassis and all the equipment necessary for the procedure. The rest of the strike force established a defensive perimeter, though they expected no trouble. The greenskins were dead or scattered, and this place felt as dead as the surface world above. Some of the Marines reported a strange unease about the location, a feeling of being watched despite the obvious emptiness, but such sensations were dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations or the lingering effects of combat stress. The operation to transfer Godfrey into the Dreadnought took 3 days. It was a process that was part surgery, part mechanical integration, and part religious ritual. The Tech Marines worked with the precision of artists, carefully extracting what remained of Godfrey's body from his ruined power armor and installing it into the life support sarcophagus that would become his new home. All the while, the chaplains chanted prayers to the Emperor and the Machine God, blessing the process and asking for divine guidance. Godfrey himself remained conscious throughout much of it, his pain managed by drugs, but his awareness maintained because the integration process required his active participation. He needed to learn to interface with the Dreadnought's systems, to think in the machine's language, to make the Warwalker's body his own. When it was done, when the sarcophagus was sealed and integrated into the Dreadnought chassis, when the weapon systems were tested and the neural links verified, Godfrey stood for the first time in his new body. He was no longer a man wearing armor. He was a walking tank, a towering engine of war that could crush enemy vehicles with its power fist and reduce infantry to smears of organic matter with its assault cannon. The Tech Marines declared the operation a success. The chaplains offered prayers of thanksgiving, and Godfrey, himself, speaking through the mechanical vox system that now served as his voice, swore that he would continue to serve the Emperor until the last enemy was slain, and the galaxy was cleansed of all who opposed the Imperial truth. But the operation had exhausted him. The neural integration, the trauma of the transformation, the sheer psychological shock of finding himself locked in a metal box, all of it had pushed even his superhuman endurance to its limits. The Tech Marines recommended that he be placed immediately into stasis sleep, to give his mind and what remained of his body time to adjust to the new reality of his existence. This was standard procedure for newly interred dreadnoughts. The first sleep helped ease the transition, allowed the neural pathways to stabilize, prevented the madness that could come from too sudden a realization of what had been lost. The Black Templars prepared to depart. They would take the Dreadnought with them, sealed in stasis and secured in the transport holds. But as they were making final preparations, a priority astropathic message reached the fleet. Another greenskin horde had been detected 3 systems away, heading toward an Imperial mining colony. The Black Templars were the only force in position to intercept them. They had to leave immediately, with no time for the careful loading procedures that transporting a dreadnought required. The decision was made to leave Godfrey behind temporarily. He was in stasis, safe and secure in the depths of this dead world. They would return for him after dealing with the greenskin threat. A matter of weeks at most. The chamber where he rested was deep within the ancient structure, protected by layers of stone and the strange black metal that lined the corridors. Nothing would disturb him. He would wait in his sleep, dreaming whatever dreams dreadnoughts dreamed, until his brothers returned to collect him. They marked the location carefully, recording the exact coordinates and leaving a locator beacon that would guide them back. They sealed the chamber behind them, activating the dreadnought's internal systems to maintain the stasis field without external power. And then they departed, their ships burning hard for the transit point that would take them to the next battle, secure in the knowledge that they would return for their fallen brother soon. They could not have known that soon would become months, and months would become years. The battle against the Greenskins proved more complex than anticipated. The enemy had a weird boy among their ranks, a psyker of surprising power who managed to tear a temporary rift in reality, scattering the Black Templars' fleet across several systems. By the time they regrouped and dealt with the threat, new priorities had emerged. A chaos incursion in a neighboring sector, a Tyranid splinter fleet detected on approach vectors, a distress call from a chapter keep under siege by traitor Astartes. The crusade moved from one war to the next, as it had for 10,000 years, always following the path of greatest need. Years became decades. The coordinates of that nameless world remained in the fleet's records, but the priority of retrieving Godfrey dropped with each passing year. He was not forgotten, exactly, but he became one more task on an ever-growing list of responsibilities that the chapter never quite had time to address. The Marines who had been present for his interment were reassigned to different crusades, killed in battle, or elevated to positions where their immediate tactical concerns took precedence over historical obligations. The knowledge that he remained there, sleeping in the depths of an empty tomb on a dead world, became one of those things that everyone knew, but nobody felt an immediate urgency to address. And so Godfrey slept. His stasis field kept him in perfect suspension, his consciousness trapped in that strange state between awareness and oblivion that Dreadnoughts knew well. He was not awake, but neither was he truly unconscious. He existed in a kind of limbo, aware on some level of the passage of time, but unable to mark its progression. Days, weeks, years, they all blurred together into a single eternal moment of waiting, waiting for his brothers to return, waiting for the war to call him again, waiting for anything to break the monotony of the perfect silence that surrounded him. Below him, separated by mere meters of stone and ancient metal, the Necrons continued their own sleep. Their stasis was different from his, deeper and more complete, but the principle was the same. Both were forms of preservation, ways of storing consciousness and memory against a future that might never come. Two forms of undeath, separated by the thinnest of barriers, each unaware of the other's existence. The years became decades, and the decades accumulated into nearly a century. And then, as if the universe had decided that this particular cosmic joke had marinated long enough, something changed. The tomb world began to wake. The process started gradually, as it always did with Necron tomb worlds. The first stirrings were not the warriors themselves, but the automated systems that maintained the tomb. Canoptek scarabs, those beetle-like constructs of living metal programmed to perform maintenance and repairs, began to activate in small numbers. They emerged from their own storage alcoves and began their endless tasks of patrolling the tomb, checking systems, repairing damage from age and seismic activity. The reason for the awakening was unclear even to the tomb's own systems. Perhaps it was the natural progression of the damaged awakening protocols, finally resolving themselves after 30 million years of computation. Perhaps it was some external trigger, a signal from another tomb world, or a change in the galactic background radiation that the sensors interpreted as meaningful. Perhaps it was simply time, whatever that meant to machines that measured duration in geological epochs. Whatever the cause, the tomb was waking, and once the process began, it followed an inexorable logic encoded in programming older than most of the galaxy's current civilizations. The scarabs went about their work with the mindless efficiency that characterized their existence. They found corridors that had collapsed, and they rebuilt them. They found power conduits that had degraded, and they replaced them. They found stasis chambers whose seals had failed, spilling their occupants into dust, and they catalogued the losses with neither emotion nor judgment. They were machines doing what machines did, following their programming without question or hesitation, and in the course of their duties, they found the intruder. The chamber where Godfrey rested had remained sealed since the Black Templars departed, but the tomb's awakening brought new attention to every corner of the structure. The scarabs detected the anomaly almost immediately. There was something in that chamber that did not belong, something that was not stone, not living metal, not any material that existed in their database of known substances. Their sensors detected heat signatures, energy readings, electromagnetic emissions that suggested active technology. Something was there that should not be. The scarabs did not have the capacity for complex decision-making. Their programming allowed them to recognize anomalies and respond according to predetermined protocols, but they could not analyze the situation or determine appropriate action beyond basic responses. An intruder in the tomb was a threat by definition, even one that appeared to be inactive. The appropriate response was clear: report the anomaly to higher functions, initiate defensive protocols, contain the threat until more sophisticated systems could assess it. More scarabs converged on the chamber. They did not have the capacity to open the sealed entrance, but they could monitor it, surrounding the door in a living carpet of clicking, skittering metal. They broadcast their findings through the tomb's internal communication network, sending the alert rippling through systems that were slowly coming online after millions of years of dormancy. The tomb's central intelligence, that artificial consciousness known as the tomb mind, received the alert. This was a system of vastly greater sophistication than the scarabs, capable of analysis and decision-making that approached something resembling genuine thought. It had been dormant along with everything else, its processes reduced to the bare minimum necessary to maintain awareness of critical systems. But the awakening of the scarabs had activated a cascade of subroutines, bringing more and more of its capacity online. The tomb mind analyzed the data the scarabs had gathered. It recognized immediately that this was no minor anomaly. The energy signatures were unlike anything in its database. The material composition was wrong, suggesting alloys and composites that should not exist, at least not according to the technological baseline of the races that had existed when the Necrons entered their long sleep. Most significantly, the readings suggested an active stasis field, a technology that the tomb mind recognized because it was fundamentally similar to the fields that maintained the Necrons themselves in their sleep. Something was sleeping in the tomb, something that was not Necron, something that was using technology sophisticated enough to maintain long-term stasis. This was not a simple intruder to be eliminated by automated defenses. This required investigation. This required the awakening of higher functions. The tomb mind initiated the next phase of the resurrection protocol. Power began flowing to the stasis chambers that housed the lowest ranks of Necron warriors. These were the baseline troops, the former citizens of the Necrontyr Empire who had been transformed into mindless automatons, retaining just enough consciousness to follow orders, but stripped of everything that had once made them individuals. They were the infantry, the expendable masses who would form the bulk of any military action. The process of awakening them was slow, measured in hours rather than moments. Each warrior had to be carefully brought out of stasis, their systems checked and verified, their neural engrams loaded with current tactical data. The tomb mind coordinated this with the efficiency of long practice, though it was hampered by the degradation its systems had suffered during the long sleep. Some chambers failed to activate. Some warriors emerged with corrupted consciousness matrices, their minds scrambled by millions of years of interrupted stasis. These were catalogued as losses, and their bodies recycled, their living metal harvested for repairs to more functional units. The awakening process followed ancient protocols established millions of years ago by cryptechs who had long since been destroyed or gone mad. Each stasis chamber was connected to the tomb's central power grid through redundant conduits, ensuring that even if primary systems failed, secondary and tertiary backups could complete the resurrection. The chambers themselves were marvels of dimensional engineering, utilizing principles of physics that made a mockery of conventional three-dimensional space. From the outside, each alcove appeared to be barely large enough to contain a single warrior, but within the folded space of the chamber, entire legions could be stored, compressed, and layered in ways that human science would have declared impossible. As power flowed through these ancient systems, the living metal that composed each warrior's body began to respond. Necrodermis was not simply an alloy or a compound in any conventional sense. It was a programmable matter, capable of repairing itself at the molecular level, of adapting to damage, of maintaining its integrity across spans of time that would have reduced any organic material to dust. The tiny machines that comprised it, those billion-strong swarms of nanoscarabs, began to activate, checking connections, repairing damage from age and entropy, preparing the body for consciousness. The consciousness itself was stored not in any single location but distributed throughout the warrior's form, encoded in patterns of energy and matter that defied simple description. It was not a soul. The Necrons had lost those during the biotransference, consumed by the Katan, or perhaps simply annihilated by the transformation from organic to mechanical. What remained was more like a recording, a pattern of thoughts and memories and basic personality traits, frozen at the moment of transformation and preserved through technology that bordered on the miraculous. When a warrior awakened, that pattern had to be loaded into the necrodermis framework, distributed through the body's systems, integrated with the sensory inputs and motor controls. It was a process that took time, and during that time, the warrior existed in a state of partial awareness, conscious but not yet fully coherent, aware of existence but not yet capable of organized thought or action. It was, in its own way, similar to the emergence of consciousness in organic beings, that gradual transition from sleep to wakefulness, but stretched across hours instead of seconds. The tomb mind monitored each awakening with patient attention, its distributed intelligence capable of tracking thousands of simultaneous processes without confusion or error. It noted which chambers were responding properly, which showed signs of degradation, which had failed completely. It calculated casualty rates and assessed whether the available forces would be sufficient for defensive operations. It prepared contingency plans for various threat scenarios, running through countless simulations in the microseconds between each actual observation. This was what the tomb mind had been designed for, this careful orchestration of awakening, this measured approach to resurrection that minimized waste and maximized combat effectiveness. It had performed these duties before, during earlier partial awakenings, when threats to the tomb had required temporary mobilization. Each time, it had learned, refining its protocols, adjusting its procedures based on what had worked and what had failed. The damage to its higher functions had not impaired these basic capacities. If anything, the endless cycles of maintenance and repair had made it more efficient at this fundamental task. But enough warriors awakened successfully. They rose from their alcoves, skeletal forms of gleaming necrodermis, articulating with mechanical precision as ancient joints and servos activated for the first time in millions of years. Their eye sockets, empty in repose, began to glow with the eerie green light of their consciousness awakening. They reached for their weapons, Gauss flares that had been in storage alongside them, energy weapons capable of stripping away their targets at the atomic level. They formed up in orderly ranks, waiting for commands from the tomb mind, with the patience of beings who had no concept of impatience, no capacity for boredom or frustration, or any of the emotions that might make waiting difficult. The tomb mind directed a squad of warriors to investigate the anomaly. 20 Necron warriors, moving in perfect synchronization, marched through the tomb's corridors toward the sealed chamber. They walked past walls decorated with hieroglyphs in languages that had been dead longer than some stars had existed. They passed through halls that had once hosted great dynastic gatherings, now empty and silent. They moved with the mechanical precision of clockwork soldiers, each step placed with perfect accuracy, each turn executed with mathematical exactness. They reached the chamber and stopped, forming a perimeter around its entrance. The scarabs parted to let them pass, their simple programming recognizing the authority of the warriors. One of the Necrons stepped forward, interfacing directly with the door's locking mechanism. The technology was not Necron, but the principles were universal enough. Lock, unlock, open, close. These were concepts that transcended specific technological implementation. The warrior found the release mechanism and activated it. The door slid open with a hiss of escaping air that had been sealed in for nearly a century. The stale atmosphere of the chamber mixed with the tomb's own recycled air, creating a brief swirl of dust and particles. The Necron warriors filed in, their glowing eyes illuminating the darkness. And there, in the center of the chamber, they found him, brother, Captain Godfrey, interred in his Dreadnought chassis, locked in stasis sleep. The Warwalker stood silent and still, its massive form dominating the chamber. Its weapons were powered down, its systems in minimal operation mode, but even in sleep, it radiated a sense of suppressed power. This was a machine built for war, designed to deliver death with brutal efficiency, currently dormant, but never truly harmless. The Necron warriors regarded it with their empty metal faces, incapable of showing emotion or surprise because they possessed neither. They simply observed, their senses gathering data, their consciousness matrices, processing information and comparing it against their limited databases. They did not recognize what they were seeing because nothing in their programming had prepared them for the concept of a dreadnought, but they recognized danger when they encountered it, even dormant danger. One of the warriors stepped closer, extending a hand toward the dreadnought's armored surface. The necrodermis of its fingers made contact with the ceramite of the Warwalker's hull. There was no immediate reaction, no alarm, no sudden activation. The stasis field held, keeping Godfrey locked in his dreamless sleep, unaware of the metal skeletons examining him with their cold, mechanical curiosity. The warriors transmitted their findings back to the tomb mind. Visual data, sensor readings, material analysis, everything they could determine about this strange object they had found sleeping in their tomb. The tomb mind processed the information with growing confusion, an emotion that it had not experienced in millions of years, and that it did not have the capacity to recognize as such. This object was clearly advanced technology, clearly a war machine of some kind, but it did not match any known design in the Necron databases. The materials were wrong, the power source was wrong, the architecture was wrong. Most puzzling of all was the stasis field itself. It was using principles that the Necrons recognized, concepts that should have been exclusive to their own technology, or perhaps to the ancient work of the Old Ones. But this field was neither. It was similar, sharing fundamental characteristics, but implemented in a completely different way. It was as if someone had independently discovered the same mathematical principles, but approached them from an entirely different angle, arriving at a solution that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The tomb mind needed more information. It needed someone with the capacity for true analysis, not just the algorithmic processing that it was capable of. It needed a higher intelligence, one of the Necron nobles, who had retained enough of their original consciousness to understand complex situations and make sophisticated decisions. It initiated the next phase of awakening, focusing on the tomb's command structure. The process of awakening a Necron noble was significantly more complex than awakening a simple warrior. The nobles had been higher-ranking members of Necrontier society before the transformation, and their consciousness matrices were correspondingly more sophisticated. They retained memories, personalities, something approaching genuine thought and emotion, though all of it was filtered through the cold logic of their mechanical forms. Awakening them required careful calibration, ensuring that their higher functions activated properly, that the neural engrams loaded correctly, that the personality survived the transition from dormancy to activity. The tomb's ranking noble was a lord known as Trazak the Unyielding, a title earned through centuries of warfare before the Great Sleep. His stasis chamber was in the tomb's deeper levels, in a section reserved for the nobility where the architecture was more elaborate, the chambers more spacious, the decorations more ornate. When the awakening signal reached his chamber, systems that had been idle for 30 million years began to activate. Power flowed through ancient circuits. The stasis field began to collapse in carefully controlled stages, and within the sarcophagus, consciousness began to return. Trazak's awakening was not immediate. Unlike the warriors who simply activated like machines being powered on, his emergence from dormancy was gradual, almost organic in its progression. Memory returned in fragments. Awareness filtered in through layers of dormancy. Identity reasserted itself against the void of non-existence. He remembered who he had been, what he had done, why he had entered the Great Sleep. He remembered the war in heaven, though the details were fragmented, corrupted by age and trauma. He remembered the biotransference, that moment of transformation when flesh became metal and mortality gave way to this eternal half-life. He remembered the decision to sleep, the expectation that they would wake to a galaxy purged of the Eldari threat. and he realized immediately that something was wrong. The awakening was too early, or perhaps too late. It was impossible to tell without accessing current astronomical data. The tomb's systems were reporting damage, failures, degradation that spoke of far more time passing than the planned duration of the Great Sleep. And most concerning of all, there was an alert, a report of an intruder, something foreign in the tomb that required his immediate attention. Trazak rose from his sarcophagus, his necrodermis form articulating with the smooth precision of living metal. He was taller than the warriors, more elaborately constructed, his form suggesting the aristocratic bearing he had possessed in life. His skull-like face was more detailed than theirs, capable of suggesting expression through the positioning of its mechanical features, even though true expression was beyond him. His single eye socket glowed with the same green light as the warriors, but brighter, more focused, suggesting greater awareness behind it. He accessed the tomb's data network directly, interfacing with the tomb mind through protocols that were part of his fundamental programming. Information flooded into his consciousness, status reports, damage assessments, the alert about the intruder, visual data from the warriors who had found it, analysis from the tomb mind, tentative and incomplete, acknowledging that this was beyond its programmed capacity to evaluate. Trazak studied the images of the Dreadnought with fascination. This was unprecedented in his experience. In all his years of war, in all the conflicts he had participated in before the Great Sleep, he had never encountered anything like this. It was clearly a war machine, clearly sophisticated technology, clearly designed by an intelligence that understood the principles of armored warfare. But it was not Catan work, not Old One technology, not anything that should exist according to his understanding of the galaxy's technological hierarchy. The stasis field suggested a level of advancement that should not exist among the younger races. The Aeldari had been primitive when the Necrons went to sleep, barely capable of warp travel, millennia away from the heights of power they would eventually achieve. The other races had been even less developed. But this technology, whatever it was, spoke of knowledge that rivaled the Necrons' own achievements. Not in scale, perhaps, but in sophistication. Someone had learned to maintain life in stasis, to preserve consciousness across time, to blend the organic with the mechanical in ways that the Necrons themselves had pioneered, but through completely different methodologies. Trazak made his way through the tomb toward the chamber where the Dreadnought waited. Other warriors joined him as he walked, emerging from their own awakening alcoves to form an honor guard around their lord. They did not speak because they had nothing to say. No capacity for the kind of casual communication that the Necrontyr had once enjoyed. They simply walked, their footsteps echoing in perfect rhythm through the empty halls, moving with the inexorable patience of beings who measured time in epochs rather than moments. When Trazak entered the chamber, the warriors parted to let him pass. He approached the Dreadnought slowly, circling it, examining it from every angle. His advanced sensors probed the Warwalker's structure, analyzing its composition, mapping its internal systems as far as the stasis field allowed. He reached out, placing his hand against its surface, feeling the vibrations of the power source that kept the stasis field active, sensing the faint electromagnetic signatures that suggested organic processes preserved within. There was something alive inside this machine, not alive in the conventional sense, not the vital energies that the Catan had once harvested with such terrible hunger, but something, a presence, a consciousness maintained against entropy, preserved through technology, waiting to wake. It was eerily similar to the Necrons' own situation, different in execution, but identical in purpose. This machine was a tomb, just as the chamber around them was a tomb, just as Trazak's own body was a tomb, for whatever remained of the consciousness that had once been a Necrontyr named Trazak. The irony was not lost on him, even filtered through his mechanical psychology. They had found a sleeper in their sleeping place, an intruder who was not intruding so much as existing in the same state they had existed in for millions of years. It was, in its own way, amusing, though Trazak had long since lost the capacity to express amusement in any conventional sense. The best he could manage was an acknowledgement of the incongruity, a recognition that the universe still had the capacity to present unexpected situations. But amusement, or its mechanical equivalent, did not change the fundamental problem. This thing was here, in the tomb, and its presence raised questions that demanded answers. Where had it come from? What race had constructed it? Why was it here, sleeping in this specific location, in this specific chamber? Was it a weapon, a trap, an accident? The Tomb Mine's analysis suggested it had been here for a relatively short time by Necron standards. Mere decades or perhaps a century, a blink of an eye compared to the millions of years the Necrons had slumbered. But that still left the question of how it had arrived and why. Trazak commanded the Tomb Mind to attempt communication with the device. This was a risky decision, potentially dangerous, but necessary. If this was a weapon of some kind, waking it could trigger an attack. But the alternative was to remain ignorant. And ignorance was its own form of danger. Better to know what they were dealing with, even if that knowledge came with risks. The Tomb Mind reached out, probing the Dreadnought systems with careful electronic tendrils, seeking any interface that might allow communication. It found ports, connection points, data channels that suggested the machine was designed to receive external input. The protocols were alien, completely different from Necron systems, but the basic concepts were universal. Binary states, voltage differentials, electromagnetic pulses. These were the fundamental language of all technology, transcending specific implementations. The Tomb Mind attempted to establish a connection. It sent carefully crafted signals, probing for responses, trying to determine if there was an intelligence on the other side that could be reached. And slowly, gradually, it began to receive responses. Not coherent communication, not yet, but acknowledgements. The Dreadnought systems were recognizing the attempts at contact, responding with automated protocols that suggested its programming included contingencies for external communication. But the stasis field was a barrier. As long as it remained active, the Dreadnought's higher functions were locked away, its consciousness trapped in that state of suspended existence. To truly communicate, to determine what this thing was and what it wanted, they would need to wake it. And that was a decision that Trazak was not prepared to make without more information. He commanded the warriors to establish a perimeter around the chamber. No other systems should be activated in this area. Nothing should be allowed to disturb the Dreadnought or interfere with it in any way until he had determined the appropriate course of action. He needed time to think, time to analyze, time to determine what this strange discovery meant for the tomb and its awakening. As he left the chamber to return to the tomb's command center, Trazak found himself experiencing something that might have been called curiosity in a being capable of such emotions. This Dreadnought represented a mystery, and mysteries were rare things in a universe the Necrons had once dominated so completely. It spoke of a galaxy that had changed in their absence, that had evolved in unexpected directions, that had produced technologies and civilizations the Necrons had not anticipated. It was evidence that the younger races, those primitives who had been barely capable of making fire when the Necrons went to sleep, had achieved things worth paying attention to. The question was, what to do about it? That would require more awakening, more of the tomb's systems brought online, perhaps even more nobles roused from their sleep to offer counsel. This was not a decision Trazak could or should make alone. It had implications for the tomb's security, for its strategic situation, for its understanding of the current galactic state. It required careful consideration, detailed analysis, consultation with those who had the capacity for sophisticated thought. The tomb continued its awakening, more systems coming online, more warriors emerging from stasis, more of the command structure being activated. And in the chamber below, Godfrey slept on, unaware of the metal skeletons examining him, unaware of the debate his presence had sparked, unaware that he had become an object of fascination for beings who had seen the birth of empires and the death of stars. He dreamed, if dreadnoughts could be said to dream, of war and duty and the Emperor's will. And around him, the Necrons watched and waited and decided what to do about this unexpected guest in their ancient tomb. The decision about what to do with the Dreadnought required more than just Trazak's judgment. As more of the tomb's nobility awakened, each brought their own perspective to the problem. A cryptech named Zarneth, one of the tomb's technological specialists, who had once been a master craftsman among the Necrontier, was particularly fascinated by the Warwalker's construction. He spent hours examining it, his enhanced sensors probing every aspect of its design, cataloging each component, analyzing the principles underlying its function. What he discovered both impressed and puzzled him. The Dreadnought was crude by Necron standards, built with materials and techniques that were primitive compared to living metal and molecular manipulation. Yet it was effective. The armor was thick and well-designed, capable of withstanding tremendous punishment. The weapon systems were powerful, perhaps not at the level of Necron Gauss technology, but still formidable. The life support systems were sophisticated, maintaining biological processes in a way that showed deep understanding of organic chemistry and physics. But it was the stasis technology that truly caught Zaneth's attention. This was not a simple freezing, not a crude suspension of biological processes. This was genuine stasis, a field that held its occupant in temporal suspension, preventing decay not through preservation, but through the elimination of time itself within the field's boundaries. It was similar to what the Necrons used, similar enough to suggest either parallel development or some form of cross-contamination between technologies that should never have met. Zaneth reported his findings to Trazak and the other awakened nobles. The Dreadnought, he concluded, was not Eldari work. The design philosophy was completely different. The implementation too direct, too brutal, lacking the elegant efficiency that characterized Eldari technology. It was not Khartan work either, obviously, since the Star Vampires had no need for such devices and would not have constructed something that preserved organic life. That left one of the younger races, and given the tomb's location, in what the Necrons would eventually learn was Imperial space, the most likely candidate was humanity. This conclusion sparked debate among the awakened nobles. Humanity? The primitives who had barely mastered fire when the Necrons went to sleep. That species had achieved this level of technological sophistication. It seemed impossible, a violation of the expected order of things. The younger races were supposed to remain primitive, manageable threats at best, irrelevant vermin at worst. They were not supposed to develop technologies that approached Necron capabilities, even in specific areas. But the evidence was undeniable. This was human technology, or at least technology created by something that appeared to be human. The neural interface systems suggested a biological template consistent with humanity. The power source, while different from Necron systems, matched theoretical models of what an advanced human civilization might develop. The weapons were the kind that humans would favor, simple kinetic and energy weapons, rather than the exotic physics-bending armaments the Necrons preferred. The realization forced a reassessment of the tomb's strategic situation. If humanity had advanced this far, if they were capable of producing war machines of this sophistication, then the galaxy the Necrons were awakening to was very different from the one they had left. This was not a universe of primitive tribes to be easily reconquered. This was a universe that had continued to evolve, where the younger races had achieved things the Necrons had not anticipated. More nobles were awakened to weigh in on the decision. A destroyer lord named Vral, who had been corrupted by the madness that sometimes claimed Necrons over extended existence, advocated for immediate destruction of the Dreadnought. It was a potential threat, he argued, and the only certain way to eliminate a threat was complete annihilation. They should dismantle it, harvest its components for study, and then obliterate everything that remained until nothing but dust remained. But others counseled caution. A royal named Nemeth, who had been a diplomat before the biotransference and retained some capacity for nuanced thinking, suggested that the Dreadnought represented an opportunity. They knew almost nothing about the current state of the galaxy. They had no intelligence about the civilizations that now dominated it, no understanding of the political landscape, no awareness of the threats and opportunities that existed. This sleeping warrior could provide that information, if they could extract it, without destroying him in the process. The debate stretched on for what humans would have measured in days. For the Necrons, locked in their timeless perspective, It felt instantaneous and eternal simultaneously. They were not bound by biological imperatives like hunger or fatigue. They could discuss and analyze without the need for rest, without the pressure of deadlines, without any of the constraints that limited organic civilizations. But they were also not particularly good at reaching consensus, their mechanical psychology making compromise and negotiation difficult. Eventually, Trazak made the decision that was his right as the tomb's ranking noble. They would wake the Dreadnought, but carefully, under controlled conditions, with every possible precaution in place. They would establish communication if possible, determine what it knew about the current galactic situation, and then decide what to do with it based on the information they gathered. It was a calculated risk, but all meaningful decisions involved risk, and the potential value of the intelligence they might gain outweighed the danger of awakening a single war machine while the tomb had hundreds of warriors standing ready. Preparations were made with typical Necron thoroughness. The chamber was cleared of all non-essential personnel. Defensive positions were established. Warriors with Gauss flares positioned to have clear lines of fire on the Dreadnought from multiple angles. Zarnath prepared systems to interface with the Warwalker's technology, to attempt communication, to shut it down if necessary. Trazak himself would be present, ready to make real-time decisions if the situation developed in unexpected ways. The process of deactivating the stasis field was delicate. They could not simply turn it off all at once. That might cause catastrophic system shock to the occupant. Instead, they needed to lower it gradually, allowing the Dreadnought's own systems to wake naturally, to transition from stasis to active operation in a controlled manner. Zanith worked carefully, his mechanical fingers manipulating controls that had been designed for human hands, but were universal enough in their principles that he could operate them. The stasis field began to collapse. The shimmer in the air around the Dreadnought, invisible to normal perception but obvious to Necron sensors, started to fade. The Warwalker's systems began to activate, power flowing through circuits that had been dormant for nearly a century. Lights flickered to life on its hull, status indicators glowing softly in the chamber's darkness. The hum of generators and motors became audible, a sound that the Necrons recognized as the mechanical equivalent of breathing. Inside his sarcophagus, Godfrey began to wake. The transition was gradual, consciousness filtering back in stages. First came awareness of existence, the fundamental knowledge that he was. Then came memory, fragmented and confused, recollections of who he had been and what had happened to him. The battle with the greenskins, the terrible wound, the decision to enter him in this metal tomb, the operation, with all its pain and terror, the final moments of settling into stasis, his brothers standing around him, promising they would return. He tried to move and felt the response of the Dreadnought's systems. His mind, interfaced with the Warwalker's neural network, sent signals that his mechanical body obeyed. He could feel his limbs, though they were power fists and weapon mounts rather than arms and hands. He could see, though his vision came from optical sensors rather than eyes. He could hear the mechanical sounds of his own operation, the whir of servos and the hum of reactors that were now extensions of his own body. But something was wrong. The last thing he remembered was his brothers sealing the chamber, the promise that they would return soon. But how much time had passed? His internal chronometer had been in stasis, along with everything else, giving him no reference point. And where were his brothers? He could not detect any of the familiar signals, the Vox frequencies that the Black Templars used, the electromagnetic signatures of Imperial technology. What he could detect were other signals, readings that made no sense, energy signatures unlike anything in his database. His optical sensors activated fully, and he saw them, the Necron warriors standing in perfect ranks around him, their Gauss flares pointed in his direction, the metal skeletons with their glowing green eyes, radiating an aura of wrongness that his every instinct recognized as Xenos, as enemy, as something that should not exist. And before them, Trazak, taller and more elaborate than the warriors, regarding him with that empty metal face that somehow managed to convey intelligent evaluation despite lacking any features that could properly express such things. Godfrey's combat protocols activated automatically. Threat detected. Xenos presence confirmed. Status: enemy contact imminent. He tried to raise his weapons, to train his assault cannon on the closest concentration of threats, to prepare for battle the way he had been programmed to respond to any hostile contact. But his systems did not respond properly. Something was interfering with his weapon systems, some external control that had locked them down. He was awake but paralyzed, conscious but helpless, trapped in his armored shell with enemies all around and no way to fight. The terror that swept through him was beyond anything he had experienced as a flesh and blood warrior. To be helpless was the ultimate nightmare for a space marine, and to be helpless while locked in a body that could not flee, could not hide, could not even properly express fear, was worse than death. He tried to access his Vox systems, to call for aid, to send a distress signal that might reach his brothers wherever they were. But those systems too were locked, controlled by whatever was interfacing with his technology. Trazak observed the Dreadnought's attempted activation with interest. The war machine had tried to prepare for combat. That much was clear from the energy signatures and the mechanical movements that had been aborted by Xaneth's control protocols. It had recognized them as threats, as it should have. It had tried to respond appropriately. This was good. It meant the consciousness inside was intact, aware, capable of responding to stimuli. They could work with that. Xaneth had established a crude communication link through the Dreadnought's external data ports. It was far from perfect, limited by the incompatibility between Necron and human systems, but it allowed for basic information transfer. The cryptech began transmitting what he hoped would be recognized as an attempt at peaceful contact. Not words, not yet. The linguistic barriers were too great. But mathematical concepts, universal constants, patterns that any technological civilization should recognize as deliberate communication rather than random noise. Inside his sarcophagus, Godfrey received the transmissions through his neural interface. His enhanced mind, trained for information processing beyond human norms, began to parse the data. He recognized it as communication, recognized the intent, even if he could not yet understand the content. Someone, or something, was trying to talk to him. The Xenos creatures were not simply attacking, they were attempting contact. This did not make them less dangerous. Xenos were Xenos, alien and unknowable, their very existence an affront to humanity's manifest destiny. The Emperor's will was clear on this matter. The alien must be destroyed, not negotiated with, not communicated with, not acknowledged as anything other than a threat to be eliminated. Every fiber of his being, every aspect of his conditioning as a Black Templar, demanded that he resist, that he fight, that he die before cooperating with these abominations. But he was helpless. His weapons were locked. His communications were jammed. He could not even move in any meaningful way. All he could do was exist, trapped in his metal prison, aware of the creatures surrounding him, knowing that they had him completely at their mercy. If they wanted him dead, there was nothing he could do to prevent it. If they wanted something else, he had no ability to refuse them. The communication attempts continued, becoming more sophisticated as Xaneth learned to interpret the responses from the Dreadnought systems. Simple concepts at first. Self, other, awareness, acknowledgement, then more complex ideas. Location, time, purpose, intent. Slowly, painfully, bridging the gap between two utterly different forms of consciousness, the cryptech and the Dreadnought began to establish a rudimentary form of dialogue. Godfrey found himself responding despite his determination to resist. Part of it was simple pragmatism. If they were going to kill him, they would have done so already. Part of it was curiosity, a desire to understand what these creatures were and what they wanted. And part of it was the simple, desperate loneliness of a consciousness that had been isolated in darkness for decades, suddenly given the chance to interact with something, anything, even if that something was a Xenos abomination. Through the primitive communication link, concepts began to flow. The Necrons wanted to know what he was. Godfrey tried to explain, though the limitations of the communication method made it difficult. He was human, or had been. He was a space marine, a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, one of the Emperor's chosen defenders of humanity. He had been wounded in battle and interred in this Dreadnought chassis to continue his service. He had been left here by his brothers, who had intended to return for him, but had not yet done so. The Necrons absorbed this information with the cold analysis of beings who processed data rather than experienced emotion. A human warrior, transformed into a war machine to extend his usefulness beyond the limits of his biological form. It was conceptually similar to what the Necrons themselves had become, though executed with far cruder technology. The parallel was obvious, almost painfully so. Both had sacrificed their flesh for continued existence. Both were now more machine than their original forms. Both were, in their own ways, undead. Trazak made his decision. This Dreadnought was not a threat, not in its current state, and the information it could provide about the current galactic situation was too valuable to destroy. They would keep it intact, study it, learn what they could from its systems and from the consciousness within. And in return, they would offer it something that Godfrey had not expected, had not even thought to hope for. They would offer him knowledge. The Necrons had been asleep for millions of years, yes, but their sensors had not been completely inactive. The tomb had maintained minimal surveillance of its surroundings, recording seismic data, stellar observations, electromagnetic radiation patterns. It was limited information, but it was information. And from it, the Necrons could make certain inferences about the galaxy's current state. Through the communication link, they transmitted what they knew. The Great Rift, that massive warp storm that had split the galaxy in two, though they did not understand its nature or significance. The movements of various stellar phenomena that suggested organized civilizations spanning multiple systems. The electromagnetic signatures of advanced technology that indicated multiple spacefaring races. The galaxy had changed, evolved, developed in ways that neither Godfrey nor the Necrons fully understood. For Godfrey, this information was both reassuring and terrifying. The Imperium clearly still existed, still spanned the stars, still waged its endless wars. But he had been asleep longer than he thought, longer than his brothers could have intended. Nearly a century, if his calculations based on the stellar data were correct. Nearly a century of waiting for rescue that had not come. Nearly a century of his chapter, moving from war to war, while he lay forgotten in this tomb. The realization hit him with crushing force. He had been abandoned. Not intentionally, perhaps, but abandoned nonetheless. His brothers had promised to return, and they had not. They had left him here, sleeping in the darkness, while decades passed, and the galaxy moved on without him. Whatever crusade had taken them from this world had led them far away, too far to return, too committed to other battles to spare the resources for retrieving one sleeping Dreadnought from a dead world in the middle of nowhere. The despair that filled him was total and absolute. He had fought for 3 centuries. He had bled for the Emperor on 100 worlds. He had earned glory and honor and the respect of his brothers. And his reward was this: to be forgotten, left behind, abandoned in a tomb filled with Xenos machines, his existence reduced to an inconvenience that his chapter had never quite found time to address. Trazak observed the emotional distress in the Dreadnought's responses with something that might have been sympathy in a being capable of such feelings. He understood abandonment. The Necrons had been abandoned by their gods, betrayed by the Catan who had promised them immortality and delivered only horror. They had been abandoned by the Silent King, who had destroyed the command protocols and disappeared into the void. They had been abandoned by the galaxy itself, which had moved on without them, leaving them to wake to a universe that no longer had a place for them. The Necron Lord made an offer that shocked everyone present, including himself. He offered the Dreadnought a choice. The tomb would wake more of its forces, assess its strategic situation, determine its place in this new galaxy. This would take time, perhaps years by human reckoning. During that time, the Dreadnought could remain here, in stasis if he preferred, or active if he chose. The Necrons would not harm him. They would not use his technology for their own purposes. They would simply allow him to exist, in peace. until either his brothers returned to retrieve him, or until the situation changed in some other way. Or, if he preferred, they would help him. The tomb had communication systems, primitive by Necron standards but functional. They could help him send a signal, a beacon that might be picked up by Imperial forces. They could provide him with information about nearby Imperial worlds. They could even, if circumstances permitted, transport him to a location where he might rejoin his chapter. Why this offer? Why this kindness to a creature that should have been their enemy? Trazak struggled to articulate the reasoning even to himself. Perhaps it was recognition of a kindred spirit, another being who had been transformed into something inhuman in service of a greater purpose. Perhaps it was sympathy for abandonment, a shared experience that transcended the vast gulf between their civilizations. Perhaps it was simple pragmatism, the recognition that treating this warrior with respect might yield better intelligence than treating him as a prisoner. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was the ghost of a dead Necrontyr named Trazak, buried deep within the mechanical construct that bore his name, recognizing a fellow sufferer and offering the mercy that he himself would have wanted in similar circumstances. Godfrey did not know how to respond. This was beyond anything his training or experience had prepared him for. Xenos were supposed to be brutal, savage, incomprehensible. They were not supposed to offer assistance. They were not supposed to show mercy. They were not supposed to recognize suffering and respond to it with anything other than predatory exploitation. But these Necrons were not following the script. They were offering him choices when they could simply have destroyed him or harvested his technology for their own purposes. They were treating him not as an enemy to be eliminated, but as an intelligence to be negotiated with. It violated every assumption he had about Xenos, every principle he had been taught about the nature of the alien threat. Through the communication link, he transmitted his response. He was a Black Templar. He could not simply accept aid from Xenos, even if they offered it freely. His chapter would view such cooperation as heresy, as betrayal of the Emperor's will. He had sworn oaths that bound him to fight against all enemies of humanity, and these Necrons, whatever their current behavior, were still enemies by definition. But he also could not deny the simple truth of his situation. He was helpless, abandoned, with no prospect of rescue. Pride was a luxury for those who had options. He had none. If these Necrons wanted to destroy him, they could. If they wanted to help him, he lacked the means to refuse. All he could do was exist, trapped in his metal shell, and respond as best he could to the situation that fate, or the Emperor, or simple random chance had placed him in. Trazak understood the dilemma without needing it explained. Honor and pragmatism warring against each other, duty conflicting with survival, the weight of oaths that bound even when circumstances made them impossible to fulfill. The Necrons had their own codes, their own hierarchies of obligation that had survived the transformation from flesh to metal. They recognized the bind that the Dreadnought was in because they had experienced similar conflicts throughout their own long existence. The Necron Lord made a suggestion. They would send a signal, a general distress call using frequencies that the tomb's sensors had detected as common to Imperial communication systems. They would not identify the Dreadnought specifically, not mention the Necron presence, simply broadcast a basic help-requested message. If Imperial forces responded, they could retrieve their lost warrior. If they did not, well, then at least an attempt had been made. This, Godfrey found, he could accept. A distress call was not cooperation with Xenos, not in any meaningful sense. It was simply a recognition of reality, a desperate measure taken by a stranded warrior trying to reconnect with his chapter. If the Emperor judged him for it, so be it. He had fought faithfully for 3 centuries. He had earned the right to try to rejoin his brothers, even if the method was less than orthodox. The signal was prepared and transmitted. It was simple, elegant in its brevity. Imperial warrior, stranded on dead world in this system. Request immediate extraction. Repeat, Imperial warrior requires extraction. The coordinates were included, precise to within meters of the tomb's entrance. Any Imperial vessel passing through this region of space would receive the signal and could investigate if they chose. Of course, there was no guarantee that any Imperial ships would pass through this region. The dead world was in the middle of nowhere, its star dying, its strategic value negligible. The Black Templars might never return, assuming they even remembered that they had left someone behind. Other Imperial forces had no reason to investigate random distress signals from abandoned systems, not with the galaxy burning and every available resource committed to fighting wars that actually mattered. But the signal was sent. It would repeat on a continuous loop, broadcasting into the void, a tiny electronic voice crying out across the darkness between the stars. And somewhere, perhaps, someone might hear it. The Necrons, for their part, continued their awakening. More systems came online. More warriors emerged from stasis. The tomb's command structure solidified as additional nobles were roused from their long sleep. They found themselves in a galaxy they did not fully understand, facing threats they could not yet identify, surrounded by younger races that had achieved levels of development the Necrons had not anticipated. The strategic situation was complex, requiring careful analysis before any major actions could be taken. And in the midst of all this, they had a guest. A human warrior locked in a machine body, sleeping when he preferred sleep, waking when he chose to be awake, treated with the respect due to a fallen enemy who had fought with honor. It was an unusual situation, unprecedented in Necron memory. But then, much about this new galaxy was proving to be unusual. Days became weeks. The distress signal continued its broadcast, unanswered. Godfrey spent his time in a state between wakefulness and sleep, his consciousness drifting in the strange limbo that Dreadnoughts knew so well. The Necrons left him largely alone, checking on him periodically to ensure his systems remained functional but otherwise respecting his isolation. They had their own concerns, their own tasks, their own process of coming to terms with the galaxy they found themselves in. Zenith visited sometimes, fascinated by the Dreadnought's technology, eager to understand the principles underlying its construction. They communicated through the crude link they had established, exchanging information about their respective technologies, finding common ground in the language of engineering and physics that transcended cultural boundaries. It was not friendship, exactly. Neither was capable of that anymore. But it was something approaching professional respect, two craftsmen recognizing each other's work, even across the vast gulf between their civilizations. Trazak came once, standing in silence before the War Walker for what might have been hours or minutes, time having little meaning to beings who did not measure their existence in biological rhythms. He did not attempt communication. He simply stood, regarding the Dreadnought with his empty metal face, thinking thoughts that even he could not fully articulate. Two tombs, one built by his own race millions of years ago, one constructed by human hands mere decades past. Two forms of undeath, standing in the darkness beneath a dying world, waiting for purposes that neither could fully define. Eventually, after weeks of silence, the distress signal received a response. It was not the Black Templars. They were engaged in campaigns halfway across the galaxy, too distant and too committed to respond to a random distress call from a dead world. It was a different chapter, one that happened to be passing through the region, investigating reports of Xeno's activity. The Crimson Fists, themselves descendants of the Imperial Fists and thus distant cousins to the Black Templars, detected the signal and diverted to investigate. Their response was cautious. A dead world broadcasting Imperial codes was suspicious, potentially a trap set by raiders or Xenos trying to lure Imperial forces into an ambush. They approached carefully, sensors active, weapons ready, prepared for anything, from void pirates to chaos cultists, to some new Xenos threat they had not yet catalogued. What they found confused them utterly. The planet registered as dead, its surface scoured by radiation, no signs of life or activity. But the signal was definitely emanating from beneath the surface, from some kind of structure buried in the planetary crust. Their scans detected energy readings consistent with advanced technology, massive chambers and corridors, systems that were clearly artificial and operational. This was not a natural formation. This was not an abandoned ruin. Something was down there, active and aware. The Crimson Fists deployed a reconnaissance force, combat teams equipped for underground operations, ready for whatever they might encounter. They followed the coordinates from the distress signal, finding the entrance to the tomb more easily than the Black Templars had, thanks to the Necrons' decision to unseal it in preparation for possible Imperial arrival. They descended into darkness, their helmet lamps cutting through shadows that had existed for millions of years. And they found the Necrons waiting for them, not attacking, not immediately threatening, but present. Rows of metal skeletons standing in perfect formation, their weapons lowered but ready. The Crimson Fists prepared for battle, recognizing the distinctive appearance of Necron warriors even if they had never personally encountered them before. This was a trap after all, they thought, though one more sophisticated than they had expected. But then Trazak stepped forward, alone, unarmed, broadcasting a message on frequencies he had learned from monitoring the Dreadnought systems. The message was simple, transmitted in crude, low Gothic, that the tomb's analysis systems had pieced together from intercepted Imperial communications. You are here for your warrior. He is unharmed. You may take him. We mean no hostility. The Crimson Fists did not understand. Xenos did not negotiate. They attacked, or they fled, or they died. They did not capture Imperial warriors and then offer to return them unharmed. It violated every principle of warfare they understood. This had to be a trick, a deception, though its purpose was unclear. Trazak gestured, and the Necron warriors parted, creating a clear path. At the end of that path, the Crimson Fists could see the Dreadnought, standing in the chamber where it had slept for so long. Godfrey had activated fully when the Imperial forces entered the tomb, his systems online and aware, his weapons no longer locked by Necron control protocols. He was free to move, free to fight if necessary, free to walk out of this tomb and rejoin his own kind. The moment was surreal. Space Marines standing face to face with Necrons, neither side attacking, neither side retreating, both simply waiting to see what would happen next. The air was thick with potential violence, every warrior on both sides ready to respond instantly if hostilities broke out. But for now, in this moment, there was only tense silence and the sound of mechanical breathing. Godfrey moved forward, his Dreadnought body articulating smoothly as he walked between the ranks of Necron warriors toward his rescuers. He did not look back at Trazak, did not acknowledge the Necrons in any way that the Crimson Fists would notice. But through the communication link that still connected him to the tomb's systems, he transmitted a final message. A single concept, difficult to express through the crude interface, but unmistakable in its meaning. Gratitude, acknowledgement, recognition of the mercy he had been shown. Trazak received the message and responded with his own. Survival, persistence, the hope that both their kinds would endure whatever the galaxy threw at them. It was as close to a blessing as a being without a soul could offer. The Crimson Fists escorted the Dreadnought out of the tomb, moving slowly, weapons ready, expecting an attack at any moment. But the Necrons simply watched them go, making no move to prevent their departure. When the Space Marines reached the surface and began the ascent to their orbiting ships, they looked back once and saw the tomb entrance sealing itself, the ancient metal doors closing with final solidity, leaving no trace that anything had ever existed there. In their ships, safe in the void above the dead world, the Crimson Fists tried to understand what had happened. They questioned the Dreadnought, asking about his captivity, about what the Necrons had done to him, about what information he might have been forced to reveal. Godfrey answered honestly, within the limits of his obligations to the chapter. He had been left behind by accident. The Necrons had found him during their awakening. They had chosen not to harm him. They had sent the distress signal that had brought rescue. That was all. The Crimson Fists did not believe him. Not entirely. It was too strange, too unlike anything they knew about Xenos behavior. They suspected some kind of contamination, some subtle corruption or programming that the Necrons had inflicted on him, but their examinations found nothing. His systems were clean, his consciousness uncorrupted, his memories consistent with what he claimed. If the Necrons had done something to him, it was too subtle for Imperial technology to detect. Eventually, reluctantly, they accepted his story at face value. Xenos had shown mercy. It was unprecedented, inexplicable, but apparently genuine. They would report it to their chapter master, who would report it to the Inquisition, who would file it away in some archive where it would gather dust alongside 10,000 other inexplicable incidents that did not fit neatly into humanity's understanding of the universe. Godfrey was eventually returned to the Black Templars. The reunion was awkward, filled with guilt and apology from his brothers who had inadvertently abandoned him, filled with quiet dignity from Godfrey, who refused to blame them for circumstances beyond their control. He was given a position of honor within the chapter, his long and faithful service recognized, his ordeal acknowledged as one more burden borne for the Emperor's sake. But he never spoke about what had happened in the tomb. When questioned, he provided the same basic facts he had given the Crimson Fists. Left behind, found by Necrons, held peacefully, released unharmed. That was all. The details, the conversations with Trazak, the weeks of strange coexistence with beings that should have been his mortal enemies, all of that remained locked in his memory, a private chapter of his long service that belonged to him alone. Sometimes, in the depths of sleep when Dreadnoughts dreamed their mechanical dreams, he thought about the tomb, about Trazak and Xaneth and the other Necrons, who had treated him not as an enemy, but as something approaching a guest, about the irony of finding mercy among Xenos while being forgotten by his own kind, about the strange kinship he had felt with beings whose existence was as much a curse as his own. He never spoke of these thoughts. They would not have been understood. The Black Templars were warriors of absolute faith, believers in clear moral absolutes, defenders of a truth that allowed for no ambiguity. To suggest that Xenos could show compassion, that enemies could act with honor, that the universe might be more complex than the simple narratives of good versus evil that sustained the Imperium, would have been heresy. But he knew, and that knowledge, locked away in his consciousness like a secret treasure, changed something fundamental in his understanding of the war, not his commitment to it, that remained absolute, not his loyalty to the Emperor, that was beyond question, but his understanding of what they were fighting for, and perhaps more importantly, what they were fighting against. The galaxy was vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond reckoning, filled with wonders and horrors that defied easy categorization. In such a universe, simple truths were lies, and the only real truth was complexity. The Necrons were enemies. Yes, Xenos abominations who would need to be fought and defeated in service of humanity's manifest destiny. But they were also something else. They were beings who had endured unimaginable horror, who had persisted through epochs that reduced civilizations to dust, who had chosen mercy when they might have chosen cruelty. That did not make them less dangerous. That did not mean they could be trusted. That did not change the fundamental reality that humanity and the Necrons were on a collision course that would eventually result in terrible war. But it meant something. What? Exactly, Godfrey could not have said, but it meant something. Back in the tomb, now sealed once more, Trazak considered the encounter. The Dreadnought had left, retrieved by his own kind, returned to whatever wars awaited him. The tomb would never see him again, unless circumstances brought them into conflict, in which case they would fight, and one or both would likely be destroyed. That was the way of the galaxy, the eternal cycle of war that defined existence in this dark millennium. But for a brief moment, there had been something else, a pause in the endless violence. A moment of understanding between beings who had both sacrificed their humanity, each in their own way, in service of causes larger than themselves. It had been temporary, fragile, impossible to sustain in a universe defined by conflict, but it had existed, and that meant something too. The tomb continued its awakening, slowly bringing more of its systems online, gradually rousing more of its inhabitants from their millions of years of sleep. Eventually, it would be fully active, its legions ready to march, its nobles prepared to reclaim what they viewed as their rightful dominion over the galaxy. There would be war, terrible and total, as there always had been and always would be. But in the depths of Trazak's programming, in whatever passed for memory in his mechanical consciousness, there remained a ghost of this encounter. A human warrior, locked in metal like the Necrons themselves, abandoned and then rescued, showing dignity in captivity and gratitude in release. It was a small thing, insignificant against the scale of galactic conflict, but it was also proof that even in a universe of only war, there could be moments of something else. The encounter between the Necrons and the Black Templars' Dreadnought would have ripple effects neither side could have anticipated. For the Imperium, it added one more data point to their incomplete understanding of the Necron threat. The Xenos could show restraint. They could negotiate. They could make choices that suggested strategic thinking beyond simple aggression. This made them more dangerous, not less, because it meant they were capable of sophisticated threat assessment and tactical flexibility. The Inquisition would spend years analyzing the reports, looking for evidence of corruption or contamination, trying to determine if the Necrons' behavior suggested some deeper threat. They would find nothing conclusive, no clear answers, just more questions about a Xenos race that continued to defy easy categorization. The Ordo Xenos in particular would be deeply troubled by the implications. If Necrons could show mercy, if they could make sophisticated judgments about when to fight and when to refrain, then they were not the mindless automatons that some Imperial scholars had theorized. They were thinking beings, capable of complex reasoning, able to pursue long-term strategies that might span centuries or millennia. This made them unpredictable in ways that simple, aggressive Xenos races were not. Some within the Inquisition would argue that the Dreadnought should be destroyed, that any warrior who had spent time in Xenos captivity, regardless of how benign that captivity appeared, represented an unacceptable security risk. The Necrons possessed technologies that the Mechanicus could barely comprehend, methods of manipulating matter and energy that seemed more like sorcery than science. Who was to say they had not done something to Godfrey during his time in their tomb? Who could guarantee that he was not now a vector for some subtle contamination, some programming or conditioning that would only reveal itself years or decades hence? But others would counsel caution. The Dreadnought's consciousness had been examined by the finest tech priests available. No evidence of tampering had been found. His memories were consistent, his personality unchanged, his loyalty to the Emperor undiminished. To destroy him, based on suspicion alone, without evidence of actual corruption, would be to punish a warrior who had already suffered greatly in the Emperor's service. It would set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that any Space Marine who survived Xenos contact was automatically suspect. The Space Marines would not accept such a policy, and the Inquisition could not afford to alienate the Adeptus Astartes by pursuing vendettas against individual warriors without cause. In the end, Godfrey would be allowed to live and continue his service, but quietly watched. Inquisitorial agents would monitor him, examining his actions for any signs of unusual behavior or suspicious choices. They would find nothing. He would fight, as he had always fought, with the same courage and dedication that had defined his 3 centuries of service. If the Necrons had done something to him, it was too subtle for even the Inquisition to detect. Or perhaps they had done nothing at all, and his story was exactly what he claimed it to be. For the Necrons, the encounter provided valuable intelligence about the current state of the galaxy. The Dreadnought systems had contained data, fragmentary and incomplete, but still useful, about Imperial technology and military doctrine. They learned about the structure of Space Marine chapters, about the existence of the Emperor and the Imperial cult that worshipped him, about the vast size of the Imperium and the countless threats it faced. This information would be integrated into the tomb's strategic databases, shared with other awakening tomb worlds through communication systems that operated at speeds and across distances that Imperial technology could not match. More importantly, the interaction had confirmed that the younger races, particularly humanity, had achieved levels of development that demanded serious attention. The existence of the Dreadnought proved that humans had mastered technologies that approached Necron capabilities in specific areas. The stasis field technology was particularly significant. While not as sophisticated as Necron systems, it demonstrated an understanding of temporal manipulation that should not have been possible for a race that had been barely past the Stone Age when the Necrons went to sleep. This suggested either remarkable progress during the millions of years of the Great Sleep, or possibly cross-contamination between technologies, knowledge transferred somehow from the Necrons or other ancient races to the younger civilizations that now dominated the galaxy. The implications were profound. If humanity could develop one piece of advanced technology, they could potentially develop others. If they understood temporal stasis, what else might they understand? What other principles of physics had they uncovered? What other technologies had they created? The galaxy the Necrons were awakening to was not the primitive wasteland they had anticipated. It was a mature technological civilization, or rather, a collection of such civilizations, each with their own capabilities and strengths. The reconquest of the galaxy would not be the simple matter of sweeping aside primitives that some had assumed. It would require careful planning, sophisticated strategy, and most importantly, better intelligence about the various races that now claimed dominion over worlds. The Necrons still considered their rightful territory. For the Necrons, the encounter provided valuable intelligence about the current state of the galaxy. The Dreadnought systems had contained data, fragmentary and incomplete, but still useful, about Imperial technology and military doctrine. More importantly, the interaction had confirmed that the younger races, particularly humanity, had achieved levels of development that demanded serious attention. This was not a galaxy ripe for easy conquest. This was a galaxy that had evolved in their absence, developing its own powers and technologies, creating civilizations that could present genuine threats to Necron supremacy. The knowledge would inform their awakening protocols, shape their strategic planning, influence their decisions about when to fight and when to bide their time. The war was coming, inevitable as the death of stars, but it would be fought with better intelligence and more realistic assessments of enemy capabilities than it might have been otherwise. But beyond these practical considerations, beyond intelligence and strategic advantage and tactical doctrine, there was something else. A memory, a ghost of an interaction that should not have happened, between beings that should have been implacable enemies, in the darkness beneath a dying world. It proved nothing. It changed nothing. The war would come regardless. And when it came, both sides would fight, with all the terrible fury they could muster. But it was there. And in a universe where moments of peace were rarer than habitable worlds, where mercy was weakness and compassion was heresy, where the only truth was war and the only certainty was death, that meant something. What exactly it meant, none of the participants could have said, but it meant something. Godfrey would fight for centuries more, a walking engine of destruction, a consciousness locked in metal, slowly losing himself to time and trauma, until finally, thankfully, he would be destroyed in battle against a tyrannid bio-titan on a world whose name he no longer remembered. In his final moments, as his systems failed and his consciousness began to fade, he thought briefly of that tomb, of the Necrons who had shown him mercy when his own brothers had forgotten him, of Trazak's empty metal face, regarding him with something that might have been respect. And Trazak would continue to serve his tomb world for millennia more, awakening fully, leading his forces in the wars to come, fighting against the younger races with the cold efficiency that defined Necron warfare. He would destroy thousands of enemies, reclaim dozens of worlds, secure his dynasty's place in the new galactic order, and always, in some buried subroutine of his programming, in some inaccessible corner of his machine consciousness, there would be a memory of a human warrior who had thanked him for mercy. Neither would ever speak of it. Neither would ever reference it in any way that outsiders could detect. But it was there. A bridge across the void, too fragile to bear any weight, too temporary to matter in any practical sense, but real nonetheless. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, there had been one moment of something else, and that was enough. So ends the tale of when the Necrons found a sleeping Black Templar's Dreadnought in their tomb. It is a small story in a galaxy of grand epics, a footnote to histories written in the blood of countless trillions. But it is our story, the story of what happens when two forms of undeath meet in the darkness and choose, for just a moment, to be something other than enemies. Make of it what you will. If you found this exploration of one of Warhammer 40,000's most fascinating what-if scenarios compelling, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the unexpected places where humanity and Xenos might find common ground, however temporary and fragile, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos exploring the darker corners of the 40k universe, the strange encounters that happen in the spaces between the major events, the stories of individual warriors caught up in circumstances beyond their control or comprehension. Leave a comment below telling us what you think would happen in this scenario. Would the Necrons really show mercy, or would their reaction be more hostile? What would the Imperium do if they learned the full truth of what transpired? How would other Space Marine chapters respond to the knowledge that Xenos could act with something approaching honor? The beauty of Warhammer 40,000 is that there are no definitive answers, only possibilities to explore and debate. And if you have suggestions for other scenarios you'd like to see explored, other strange meetings between factions that normally only meet in battle, other corners of the lore that deserve deeper examination, let us know. The galaxy is vast, the stories are endless, and there are always more tales to tell about this dark millennium where there is only war, except for those brief moments when there is something else. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of a Necron tomb world, into the consciousness of a sleeping Dreadnought, into the strange space where mercy and duty and abandonment and honor all collide in ways that defy easy understanding. Until next time, may the Emperor protect you, may your weapons never fail, and may you find mercy even in the darkest corners of the galaxy. For in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even the smallest moment of peace is worth remembering.